Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Patriot's History. I am Larry Schweikart, co-author of Patriot's History of the United States with Michael Allen and your host. And as always, we've been reading through Patriot's History of the United States. And currently we're in the American Revolution. And last time I read through the Declaration of Independence. Now, usually I'm reading from the 15th anniversary edition, just so you know. However, today, we're going to do something just a little bit different. I'm going to read an article to you from the father of Rush Limbaugh, and that would be Rush H. Limbaugh Jr. And he delivered this address a number of times, and Rush printed it in his Limbaugh letter, and it is called "The Americans Who Risked Everything About the Signers of the Declaration." So today I'm just going to read that article. It was a glorious morning. The sun was shining and the wind was from the southeast. Up especially early, a tall, bony, red-headed young Virginian found time to buy a new thermometer, for which he paid £3 15 shillings. He also bought gloves for Martha, his wife, who was ill at the house. Thomas Jefferson arrived early at the State House. Temperature was 72.5 degrees, and the horseflies weren't nearly so bad at that hour. It was a lovely room, very large and gleaming white walls. The chairs were comfortable. Facing the single door were two brass fireplaces, but they would not be used today. The moment the door was shut, it was always kept locked, and the room became an oven. The tall windows were shut so that loud quarreling voices could not be heard by passers-by. Small openings atop the windows allowed a slight stir of air and also a large number of horseflies. Jefferson records that, quote, "the horseflies were dexterous in finding necks, and the silk of stockings was nothing to them. All discussing was punctuated by the slap of hands on necks." On the wall at the back, facing the president's desk, was a panoply consisting of a drum, swords, and banners seized from Fort Ticonderoga the previous year. Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had captured the place, shouting that they were taking it, quote, "in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress." Now Congress got to work, promptly taking up an emergency measure about which there was discussion, but no dissension. Resolved that an application be made for the Committee of Safety of Pennsylvania for the supply of flints for the troops of New York. Then Congress transformed itself into a committee of the whole. The Declaration of Independence was read aloud once more, and the debate resumed. Though Jefferson was the best writer of all of them, he'd been somewhat verbose. Congress hacked away the excess. They did a good job, as side-by-side comparison of the rough draft and the final text shows. They cut the phrase "by a self-assumed power." "Climb" was replaced with "must read," and then was eliminated. Then the whole sentence, and soon the whole paragraph, was cut. Jefferson groaned as they continued what he later called their depredations. By the way, it's a word he used in the Declaration. Inherent and inalienable rights came out certain unalienable rights, and to this day, no one knows who suggested the elegant change. A total of 86 alterations were made, almost 500 words were eliminated, leaving 1,337. At last, after 3 days of wrangling, the document was put to a vote. Here in this hall, Patrick Henry had once thundered, "I am no longer a Virginian, sir, but an American." But today, the loud, sometimes bitter argument stilled, and without fanfare, the vote was taken from north to south by colonies, as was the custom. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted. There were no trumpets blown, no one stood on his chair and cheered. The afternoon was waning, and Congress had no thought of delaying the full calendar of routine business on its hands. For several hours, they worked on many other problems before adjourning for the day. What kind of men were the 56 signers who adopted the Declaration of Independence, and who, by their signing, committed an act of treason against the crown? To each of you, the names Franklin, Adams, Hancock, and Jefferson are almost as familiar as household words. Most of us, however, know nothing of the other signers. Who were they? What happened to them? I imagine that many of you are somewhat surprised by the names not there. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Patrick Henry, all were elsewhere. Washington and Hamilton were in the battlefield. Ben Franklin was the only really old man. 18 were under 40. 3 were in their 20s. Of the 56, almost half, 24, were judges and lawyers. 11 were merchants. 9 were landowners and farmers. And the remaining 12 were doctors, ministers, and politicians. With only a few exceptions, such as Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, these were men of substantial property. All but 2 had families, the vast majority of the men of education and standing in their communities. They had economic security as few men had in the 18th century. Each had more to lose from revolution than he had to gain by it. John Hancock, one of the richest men in America, already had a price of 500 pounds on his head. He signed an enormous letter so that His Majesty could now read his name without glasses and could now double the reward. Ben Franklin wryly noted, "Indeed, we must all hang together, otherwise we shall most assuredly hang separately." Fat Benjamin Harrison of Virginia told tiny Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, "With me, it'll all be over in a minute, but you will be dancing on air an hour after I am gone." These men knew what they risked. The penalty for treason was death by hanging. And remember, our great British fleet was already at anchor in New York Harbor. They were sober men. There were no dreamy-eyed intellectuals or draft card burners here. They were far from hot-eyed fanatics yammering for an explosion. They simply asked for the status quo. It was change they resisted. It was equality with the mother country they desired. It was taxation with representation they sought. They were all conservatives, yet they rebelled. It was principle, not property, that had brought these men to Philadelphia. 2 of them became presidents of the United States. 7 of them became state governors. 1 died in office as vice president of the United States. Several would go on to be U.S. senators. 1, the richest man in America in 1828, founded the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. 1, a delegate from Philadelphia, was the only real poet, musician, and philosopher of the signers. It was he, Francis Hopkinson, not Betsy Ross, who designed the American flag. Richard Henry Lee, a delegate from Virginia, had introduced a resolution to adopt the Declaration of Independence in June 1776. He was prophetic in his concluding remarks. Quote, "Why then, sir, why do we delay? Why still deliberate? Let this happy day give birth to an American republic. Let her arise not to devastate and to conquer, but to reestablish the reign of peace and law." The eyes of Europe are fixed upon us. She demands of us a living example of freedom that may exhibit a contrast in the felicity of the citizen to the ever-increasing tyranny which desolates her polluted shores. She invites us to prepare an asylum where the unhappy may find solace and the persecuted riposte. If we are not this day wanting in our duty the names of American legislatures in 1776, will be placed by posterity at the side of all those whose memory has been and ever will be dear to virtuous men and good citizens, unquote. Though the resolution was formally adopted July 4, it was not until July 8 that 2 of the states authorized their delegates to sign, and it was not until August 2nd that the signers met at Philadelphia to actually put their names on the declaration. William Ellery, delegate from Rhode Island, was curious to see the signers' faces as they committed the supreme act of personal courage. He saw some men sign quickly, quote, but in no face was he able to discern real fear, unquote. Stephen Hopkins, Ellery's colleague from Rhode Island, was a man past 60. As he signed with a shaking pen, he declared, quote, My hand trembles, but my heart does not. Even before the list was published, the British marked down every member of Congress suspected of having put his name to treason. All of them became the objects of vicious manhunts. Some were taken. Some, like Jefferson, had narrow escapes. All who had property or families near British strongholds suffered. Francis Lewis, New York delegate, saw his home plundered and his estates in what is now Harlem completely destroyed by British soldiers. Mrs. Lewis was captured and treated with great brutality. Though she later was exchanged for 2 British prisoners through the efforts of Congress, she died from the effects of her abuse. William Lloyd, another New York delegate, was able to escape with his wife and children across Long Island Sound to Connecticut, where they lived as refugees without income for 7 years. When they came home, they found a devastated ruin. Phillips Livingston had all of his great holdings in New York confiscated and his family driven out of their home. Livingston died in 1778, still working in Congress for the cause. Lewis Morris, the 4th New York delegate, saw all his timber, crops, and livestock taken. For 7 years, he was barred from his home and family. John Hart of Trenton, New Jersey, risked his life to return home to see his dying wife. Hessian soldiers rode after him, and he escaped in the woods. While his wife lay on her deathbed, the soldiers ruined his farm and wrecked his homestead. Hart, age 65, slept in caves and woods as he was hunted across the countryside. When at long last, emaciated by hardship, he was able to sneak home, he found his wife had already been buried and his 13 children taken away. He never saw them again. He died a broken man in 1779 without ever finding his family. Dr. John Witherspoon, signer, was president of the college in New Jersey, later called Princeton. The British occupied the town of Princeton and billeted troops in the college. They trampled and burned the finest college library in the country. Judge Richard Stockton, another New Jersey delegate signer, had rushed back to his estate in an effort to evacuate his wife and children. Family found refuge with friends, but a Tory sympathizer betrayed them. Judge Stockton was pulled from bed in the night and brutally beaten by the arresting soldiers. Thrown into a common jail, he was deliberately starved. Congress finally arranged for Stockton's parole, but his health was ruined. Judge was released as an invalid when he could no longer harm the British cause. He returned home to find his estate looted and did not live to see the triumph of the revolution. His family was forced to live off charity. Robert Morris, merchant prince of Philadelphia, delegate and signer, met Washington's appeals and pleas for money year after year. He made and raised arms and provisions, which made it possible for Washington to cross the Delaware at Trenton. In the process, Morris lost 150 ships at sea, bleeding his own fortune and credit almost dry. George Clymer, Pennsylvania signer, escaped with his family from their home, but their property was completely destroyed by the British in the Germantown and Brandywine campaigns. Dr. Benjamin Rush, also from Pennsylvania, was forced to flee to Maryland. A heroic surgeon with the Army, Rush had several narrow escapes. John Martin, a Tory, in his views previous to the debate, lived in a strongly loyalist area of Pennsylvania. When he came out for independence, most of his neighbors and even some of his relatives ostracized him. He was a sensitive and troubled man, and many believe this action killed him. When he died in 1777, his last words to his tormentors were, quote, "Tell them that they will live to see the hour when they shall acknowledge it, the signing, to have been the most glorious service I have ever rendered to my country," unquote. William Ellery, Rhode Island delegate, saw his property and home burned to the ground. Thomas Lynch Jr., South Carolina delegate, had his health broken from privation and exposures while serving as a company commander in the military. His doctors ordered him to seek a cure in the West Indies, and on the voyage, he and his young bride were drowned at sea. Edward Rutledge, Arthur Middleton, Thomas Hayward Jr., the three other South Carolina signers, were taken by the British in the siege of Charleston. They were carried as prisoners of war to St. Augustine, Florida, where they were singled out for indignities. They were exchanged at the end of the war, the British in the meantime having completely devastated their large land holdings and estates. Thomas Nelson, signer of Virginia, was at the front in command of the Virginia military forces. With British General Charles Cornwallis in Yorktown, fire from 70 heavy American guns began to destroy Yorktown piece by piece. Lord Cornwallis and his staff moved their headquarters into Nelson's palatial home. While American cannonballs were making a shambles of the town, the house of Governor Nelson remained untouched. Nelson turned in a rage to the American gunners and asked, "Why do you spare my home?" They replied, "Sir, out of respect to you." Nelson cried, "Give me the cannon," and fired on his magnificent home himself, smashing it to bits. But Nelson's sacrifice was not quite over. He had raised $2 million for the revolutionary cause by pledging his own estates. When the loans came due, a New York peacetime Congress refused to honor them, and Nelson's property was forfeited. He was never reimbursed. He died impoverished a few years later at age 50. Of those 56 who signed the Declaration of Independence, 9 died of wounds or hardships during the war. 5 were captured and imprisoned, in each case with brutal treatment. Several lost wives, sons, or entire families. One lost his 13 children. 2 wives were brutally treated. All were at one time or another victims of manhunts and driven from their homes. 12 signers had their homes completely burned. 17 lost everything they owned, yet not one defected or went back on his pledged word. Their honor and the nation they sacrificed so much to create is still intact. And finally, there's the New Jersey signer, Abraham Clark. He gave 2 sons to the officer corps in the Revolutionary Army. They were captured and sent to the infamous British prison hulk afloat in New York Harbor, known as the Hell Ship Jersey, where 11,000 American captives were to die. The younger Clarks were treated with special brutality because of their father. One was put in solitary and given no food. With the end of the war almost in sight, with the war almost won, could anyone have blamed Abraham Clark for begging for mercy from the king and parliament? The utter despair in this man's heart, the anguish in his soul must reach out to each and every one of us down through the 200 years with the answer, no. The 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence proved by their every deed that they made no idle boast when they composed the most magnificent curtain line in American history. And for the support of this declaration, and with firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So that's the reading for today. Next time we will pick up back with reading Patriot's History of the United States, and we will look at the campaign as it goes north to Saratoga and our first major open field victory in the American Revolution. In the meantime, make sure you're checking out the Wild World of History. I'm adding new stuff. I'm adding a whole new series called Integrity. We're looking at men and women of integrity over the ages, and I'm starting with Winston Churchill. Of course, we'll get to George Washington at some point. Make sure also you check out the Buy Larry a Coffee campaign. We are trying to turn Patriot's history into a video series like John Adams, Sons of Liberty, or even The Chosen. And to do that, we need some money. So I need your help. Buy me a coffee. Watch the trailer, and if you like it, buy me a coffee. Buy me 10 coffees. Buy me 100 coffees. All money goes directly to making the film. And I will see you guys back here on Monday.